So imagine opening a locked diary that belonged to, say, your great-grandfather. You're expecting to find some quaint family history, but instead you uncover this just shocking, scandalous confession.
Yeah, that would be pretty jarring.
Right. And reading the text we are looking at today, it feels incredibly similar to that. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're taking a deep dive into Genesis chapter 38, specifically looking at verses 6 through 11.
And this passage, it details the genuinely grim events surrounding Judah, Tamar, and Onan.
Yeah, which is an area people usually just fast forward through. I mean, if you were reading the book of Genesis out loud to a group, you'd probably skip it. It's treated like this embarrassing family secret.
Oh, for sure. But our goal for this conversation today is to unpack how this text is, well, it's absolutely not a random interruption.
Right.
The materials we are reviewing contend that this is a striking theological exposure. It exposes human sin, divine justice, and God's absolute sovereignty in preserving the promised Messianic seed.
I mean, reading it, I was initially surprised at just how dark the passage is. It's a heavy text.
It is quite an intense passage. We are dealing with events that are morally dark, domestically painful, and, spiritually sobering.
Yeah.
The commentators and the historical analyses we gathered, they make a pretty compelling case that Holy Scripture never wastes words. What appears on the surface to be this, detour from the grand narrative is actually an inspired exposure.
It forces you to look steadily at realities that, let's be real, many would rather avoid entirely.
Yeah, we are talking about hidden wickedness, selfish desires, the neglect of covenant duties, cowardly leadership, and the immense peril of treating God's order with contempt.
Well, I want to start by looking at the structural design of the text.
Mm-hmm.
Because to really grasp what is happening with Judah and his family, we have to look at where this sits within the broader book of Genesis.
Right. The literary context is crucial here.
So we had this massive story of Joseph happening. In Genesis 37, Joseph is betrayed by his brothers, led, notably, by Judah himself, which is a huge detail,
Right.
and he's sold into slavery. He's taken down to Egypt.
Yep.
Then suddenly the camera cuts away. The text shifts to Judah living in Canaan in chapter 38. After this whole dark sequence of events plays out, the narrative goes right back to Joseph in Egypt in chapter 39.
It really is a sharp pivot.
It's like reading a gripping thriller about one character, and the author suddenly cuts to a seemingly unrelated domestic drama. You initially want to skip it, but realize later it holds the key to the entire plot.
That's a great analogy.
So, looking at this from a literary perspective, why the sudden camera shift?
Well, that camera shift has actually been a massive point of contention in academic circles for a long time.
Really? Like, scholars argue over just the placement of the chapter.
Oh, yeah. A lot of liberal critical scholars, particularly those who follow what is called the documentary hypothesis or the JEDP theory, they often dismiss chapter 38 as a clumsy redaction.
Wait, let's pause there so we don't lose anyone. What is the documentary hypothesis in plain English?
Good catch. So the documentary hypothesis is basically this academic theory claiming that the first 5 books of the Bible were not authored by Moses.
Okay.
Instead, the theory says they were pieced together centuries later by various anonymous editors. They argue these editors took different source documents labeled J, E, D, and P and just mashed them together.
Got it.
So when these critical scholars look at Genesis 38 interrupting the Joseph story, they see it as an editor's mistake. They think a scribe just clumsily dropped a disjointed piece of text about Judah right into the middle of the Joseph narrative.
Basically claiming the biblical author was just bad at editing.
Yeah, pretty much. However, the theological materials we're examining, they vehemently reject that academic view.
Right.
They argue the placement is a masterful, spirit-inspired contrast. When you examine the trajectories of the two brothers side by side, the theological intent becomes undeniable.
And the contrast really is jarring when you put them next to each other. I mean, you have Joseph, isolated in a pagan land, surrounded by Egyptian culture.
Surrounded by temptation.
Right, he faces intense pressure in Potiphar's house, yet he remains pure and faithful. Then you look at Judah. Judah's living right in the heart of the Promised Land, the place of covenant blessing.
But his life looks totally different.
He functionally assimilates to the pagan culture around him. He departs from his brothers. He associates closely with a Canaanite man named Heir. He marries the daughter of a Canaanite, Shua.
Yeah, he establishes a household that reflects the corrupting influence of life among the nations. The covenant family was called to be distinct. Yeah.
Right.
They were meant to be separate from the idolatry surrounding them. Yet here, Judah is shown entangled with the surrounding culture, resulting in severe spiritual decay.
Does this imply the greatest threat to the covenant wasn't external persecution in Egypt, but internal compromise?
That is precisely the point the sources make. This literary placement highlights a terrifying reality. The most lethal threat to the covenant promises of God is not external hardship. It is internal assimilation.
Wow.
It is moral compromise from within the ranks of the chosen family. Joseph is physically captive, but spiritually free. Judah is physically free, but spiritually captive to the Canaanite way of life.
Which means the greatest danger wasn't the Egyptian slave traders. It was Judah deciding to act like a Canaanite.
Yes.
So Judah is compromised, his household is rotting from the inside, and he procures a wife for his firstborn son, That wife is Tamar. This sets the stage for a specific ancient practice that drives the action of this text.
And to understand why these actions carry such massive weight, we really need to establish the cultural framework of Judah's household.
Because it's pretty foreign to us today.
Very foreign. The practice we see here is an early form of levirate marriage.
Let's unpack that.
Sure. The term comes from the Latin word lever, meaning husband's brother. This passage provides the earliest biblical record of this custom, long before Moses formally codified it in Deuteronomy under the giving of the law.
Right. God's progressive revelation often worked within existing cultural frameworks.
Yeah, and if you look at ancient Near Eastern texts like the Middle Assyrian laws or the Hittite laws, you find similar customs of a brother marrying a deceased sibling's widow.
So let's paint a picture of what life was actually like for a widow in the ancient Near East. Today, we have, life insurance, Social Security, various safety nets.
We have options.
Right. In that era, if your husband died and you had no children, what was your reality?
Your reality was total economic destitution. I mean, in ancient patriarchal societies, women generally did not hold property independently.
So she was completely reliant on the family structure.
Entirely. Your financial security, your physical protection, your social standing, all of it was tied to the men in your life. First your father, then your husband, and eventually your sons.
So if your husband died before you had a son,
you were incredibly vulnerable. The pagan laws in surrounding nations created this brother-in-law marriage custom as a social safety net, but primarily as an economic mechanism.
keep the money in the family.
Yes. The Hittite and Assyrian laws were designed to keep property, agricultural land, and dowries strictly within a specific patriarchal clan. It was about keeping the farm in the family.
But the research we're looking at draws a massive distinction between that pagan practice and what is happening here in Genesis. I mean, critical scholars might claim the Bible just copied these pagan property codes.
But the biblical framework carries an infinitely heavier theological burden. This is not about preserving a plot of dirt in Canaan.
So what is it about?
It is tied directly to the preservation of the seed of the woman prophesied all the way back in Genesis 3:15.
Okay. The promise in the garden.
Right. After the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden, God promised that a seed and offspring of the woman would one day crush the head of the serpent.
And the rest of the book of Genesis tracks this specific bloodline.
It goes from Seth to Noah to Shem to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and now the focus narrows to the tribe of Judah. This is about the survival of the covenant line that leads to the Davidic throne and the Messiah.
That completely changes how we read the text because, modern readers look at this and see a strange, ancient, romantic, or sexual indiscretion.
They completely miss the redemptive historical stakes.
Right. If this was just a standard cultural norm of the era, why does God react with such severity? Is it because they are gambling with the very lineage of the promised Savior?
Spot on. The tribe of Judah must survive for the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be fulfilled. When dies without an heir, the duty falls to the second son, Onan.
And it's not a casual request.
Not at all. This duty is not just a family chore. It is an active participation in the outworking of God's sovereign decree to bring forth the Messiah. Refusing this duty was an act of high treason against the God of the covenant.
Okay, so let's look at the actual events and the swift, active judgments carried out in the text. Genesis 38, verse 7 gives us the first crisis. It says, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death.
It is incredibly abrupt.
We get no details on the specific sin.
Right, and the brevity is intentional. The Hebrew word ra is used for wicked, and the text specifically notes this wickedness was baini, YHWH, in the eyes of Yahweh.
So the narrator does not bother to specify particular sins.
That silence is highly instructive. The decisive factor is not the specific nature of the sin, but the absolute verdict of God's holy justice.
So human witnesses might have been totally oblivious to whatever was doing behind closed doors.
He might have appeared as a respectable citizen to his neighbors. But the divine perspective governs the narrative. God saw the hidden reality of his heart and his actions.
The commentaries really zoom in on the phrasing, and the Lord put him to death. The verb phrase here is YHWH, and I know you have notes on the grammar here, but let's break it down without getting lost in the seminary jargon.
Sure.
What does that specific Hebrew phrasing actually convey to the reader?
I will spare you the technical parsing. In English, we might just say someone died, which sounds like a natural biological process, a heart attack, a disease, old age.
Right.
But the specific Hebrew structure here denotes direct causative action by God. It means God actively executed him.
Wow.
Yeah, and the papers we read assert this explicitly refutes modern theological constructs like open theism.
For the listener who might not be familiar with that term, open theism is the idea that God doesn't actually know the future perfectly, or that he limits his own knowledge to allow human free will to play out.
Right. It paints a picture of a God who is watching from heaven, reacting to our choices, and doing his best to manage the fallout.
Like he's just hoping it all works out.
Yes, and this text shatters that construct. God is not a passive observer wringing his hands over Er's bad behavior. Yahweh actively intervened with lethal force.
He stepped into history.
God is the sovereign Lord of life and death, protecting his holiness and his messianic decree. He removed from the timeline.
Which brings us to the second son, Onan. And this is where the psychology of the text becomes terrifyingly clear. Judah commands Onan to provide offspring for his brother to perform that levirate duty.
And Onan goes through the outward motions?
But verse 9 notes he knew that the offspring would not be his. He engages in the physical union with Tamar, but deliberately wastes his seed on the ground to avoid the duty.
The exegesis of Onan's sin provides some of the most rigorous analysis in our source material. Onan's action is premeditated.
It wasn't an accident.
Not at all. The Hebrew grammar actually indicates a repeated, habitual pattern of rebellion. This was not a one-time failure of judgment. Whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would destroy the seed.
Let's get into the mind of Onan for a second to explain why he is doing this. Under the laws of inheritance, the firstborn son gets a double portion of the family estate, right?
Yes, a double portion.
Was the firstborn. When dies childless, Onan, as the second son, is next in line for that massive inheritance.
Exactly, well, precisely that.
If Onan fulfills his duty and gives Tamar a son, that child will legally be considered son. That child will take the firstborn inheritance.
And if Onan refuses, and line is wiped out,
Onan gets to keep all the wealth for himself.
You are hitting on the precise calculation happening in Onan's heart. He is weaponizing the intimacy of the marriage bed for financial greed.
That is so dark.
He wants the physical pleasure, but he refuses the responsibility. He wants the inheritance, and he is willing to obliterate his brother's name to get it.
Our sources do a lexical deep dive here that I found really fascinating. They look at the specific Hebrew verb used for Onan's action. It is the word shachak.
Yeah, this is a massive detail. Moses, the author of Genesis, had a variety of vocabulary words available. He bypasses the common Hebrew word for spilling or pouring out, which is shafak.
So he didn't just use a generic word for spilling.
No, he deliberately chooses shachat, which means to ruin, destroy, or corrupt. If we track the frequency and usage of this specific verb in the early chapters of Genesis, the theological weight becomes staggering.
Right, because it shows up in some major events.
It is the exact same verb used in Genesis 6 to describe the total catastrophic corruption of the earth that provoked the global flood.
The flood.
Yes, and it is the same verb used in Genesis 13 to describe the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, using the same word as the destruction of Sodom frames this totally differently. He isn't just breaking a cultural rule. It's not just breaking a window. It's trying to burn down the entire house while living inside it.
The papers describe his actions as cosmic vandalism.
Cosmic vandalism. I like that phrase.
Onan was attempting to obliterate the very lineage of the Messiah. By spilling his seed to the ground, he was actively seeking to preserve his own inheritance by ensuring line was blotted out.
So he's fighting God's plan.
He wanted to extract the physical pleasure of God's design while vehemently rejecting the covenantal mandate. His sin was a direct assault on the decree of God.
And for this brazen rebellion, God swiftly executed him as well. Verse 10 mirrors verse 7. What he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also.
The repetition of the divine execution forms this terrifying structural parallel. It proves that God will not be mocked by hidden sins.
Because human courts could never prosecute Onan. There were no witnesses in the bedchamber.
He could have easily claimed he was trying, and Tamar was just barren. He could have played the victim.
But God saw the heart, and God executed justice.
He did.
So now Judah has lost 2 sons to divine judgment. This brings us to the fallout. How does the patriarchal leader handle this massive crisis?
We see the complete collapse of Judah's leadership. The structure of the narrative shifts to his reaction. He operates purely on fear and worldly pragmatism.
Which is such a human reaction, honestly.
It is. He tells Tamar, his daughter-in-law, to return to her father's house and remain a widow until his 3rd son, Shelah, grows up.
From a purely human perspective, Judah thinks he's just being a protective dad. He looks at Tamar and probably assumes she is cursed. 2 sons have died immediately after marrying her.
Any father would be terrified for his last remaining boy.
Right? But the sources are arguing that prioritizing family safety over God's specific command is actually faithless cowardice. How does the text balance that?
Well, the narrator completely unmasks Judah. The text reveals his hidden inward motive. He's terrified Shelah will die too.
So his outward command to Tamar sounds prudent. It sounds like he is just asking for time.
But it is born of superstition and faithless self-preservation. He chooses his own perceived safety over his covenantal duty. He assumes the problem is Tamar, completely blind to the fact that his own sons were executed for their own wickedness.
And Tamar is one left bearing the entire cost of his cowardice. She is suspended in this agonizing uncertainty.
Left totally exposed.
She is sent back to her father's house, wearing the garments of a widow. In that society, her father would likely struggle to support her, and she has no prospect of remarrying outside the family because she is legally bound to wait for Shelah.
She has no security, no inheritance, and no future. The men who wield authority over her have failed her spectacularly.
We have to consider the original audience hearing this narrative to understand the full weight of this failure. Moses wrote Genesis for the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, standing on the edge of entering Canaan.
Right. A very specific audience.
This was a generation prone to complaining, prone to idolatry, and demonstrating a severe lack of faith in God's promises. So Moses is standing before this massive crowd of Israelites in the desert, and he tells them this incredibly dark story about one of their own founding patriarchs. What was his goal?
It doesn't exactly build national pride.
No, it shatters national pride. First, Moses intended to produce a holy fear of God's immediate judgment on hidden sins.
Because they needed to know God sees everything.
Yes, the wilderness generation needed to know that physical descent from Abraham did not grant them immunity from divine wrath. If God struck down the sons of Judah, he would strike down any Israelite engaging in similar rebellion.
That is a harsh wake-up call. And second, Moses was issuing a prophetic warning against adopting Canaanite practices. The Israelites were about to enter a land saturated with pagan fertility cults and selfish, anti-covenantal behavior.
So Judah is the cautionary tale.
Judah's disastrous intermarriage and the subsequent moral collapse of his sons showed the generational ruin that comes from assimilation.
The commentators also point out a massive theological humbling happening here. By the time Moses is reading this, the tribe of Judah held a prominent leadership position among the Israelites. They led the march through the wilderness.
They were front and center.
It would be very easy for a Judean to develop spiritual pride, thinking their tribe was chosen to lead because they were inherently better, braver, or more moral than the other tribes.
But this text destroys that pride entirely. By exposing the cowardice of Judah and the the massive wickedness of his firstborn sons, the text proves that their selection was based entirely on unmerited sovereign grace.
Grace, not merit.
It highlights the doctrine of unconditional election. The tribe of Judah was not chosen for their righteousness. They were chosen despite their massive depravity. God preserves his people because of his own faithfulness, not their merit.
That sets up a huge unresolved tension in the narrative. The human leaders have failed at every level. The promised Messianic line is dangling over the abyss of non-existence. Is dead.
Onan is executed.
Shelah is being withheld by a cowardly father. The tribe of Judah is unraveling from the inside. The human structures designed to protect the promise have completely collapsed. How does this massive unresolved tension point forward to the ultimate resolution?
The theological analysis we are referencing draws a sharp Christological contrast here. They look at Onan and contrast him with the true and better brother, Jesus Christ.
Oh, that's a fascinating angle.
Under the levirate principle, Onan was called to act as a kinsman redeemer. He He was asked to humble himself, lay aside his personal inheritance, and give life so his brother's name would not be blotted out.
But he chose absolute selfishness.
He held on to his own life, his own wealth, and his own name, refusing to bear the cost of redemption.
Then you look at Jesus, the true Lion of the tribe of Judah, the final kinsman redeemer. If Onan is the picture of human selfishness, Christ is the exact opposite.
The sources reference the Apostle Paul's writing in Philippians chapter 2. Christ did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped.
Right.
He did not cling to his own status, his own heavenly inheritance or self-preservation. He emptied himself. He stepped out of glory and humbled himself to the point of death on a cross.
Where Onan took life to serve himself, Jesus gave his life to save his bride.
Yes. Christ poured out his life's blood so that a spiritually dead people could be raised to life, regenerated, and adopted into the family of God, bearing his eternal name.
It is staggering when you put them side by side. Onan refuses to lose his earthly inheritance for one person. Jesus abandons his heavenly glory for a multitude.
The contrast is breathtaking.
And the gospel writers don't hide this dark history either.
Yeah.
I mean, it's striking that the gospel writers don't sweep this under the rug. If you read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, they put Tamar's name right there on page 1.
Right out in the open.
They highlight the scandal. Does this mean the text is actually setting us up to crave a better savior because the human ones fail so miserably?
I think so. The inclusion of Tamar reminds the reader that the Messiah entered history through a lineage marked by weakness, scandal, and divine mercy. It magnifies the grace of God.
Because it wasn't a clean lineage.
No. And our research also notes that Jesus addresses the Sadducees regarding this very levirate law in Matthew 22.
Oh, the scenario with 7 brothers.
Yeah. The Sadducees, who rejected the supernatural, tried to use a hypothetical scenario about 7 brothers dying to mock the concept of resurrection.
And how does Jesus respond?
Jesus rebukes them fiercely. He shows them that the final fulfillment of God's promises regarding life and the seed is not found in biological heirs or earthly property management. It is found in the miraculous resurrection of the dead.
So we have this ancient text, this historical failure, pointing directly to the perfect obedience and resurrection of Christ. But the authors of these theological papers don't stop in the ancient world.
They definitely do not.
They pull this narrative straight into the present day. So the authors are not treating Genesis 38 as ancient history. They are holding it up as a mirror, reflecting the exact attitudes driving today's cultural and spiritual landscape. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a very fair assessment. The commentaries we are reviewing draw fierce contemporary applications. They look at the psychological mechanics of Onan's sin and see it reflected everywhere in the modern idol of radical individualism.
Meaning what, practically?
They're talking about the prevailing cultural philosophy of my life, my body, my rules. Okay. The authors are taking this ancient text and aiming it directly at modern Western culture. To illustrate this, they point to what they call a demographic winter in the Western world.
Yes.
As impartial reporters of the source material, it's worth noting they bring up falling birth rates, specifically citing the U.S. fertility rate plummeting to 1.62 births per woman, which is far below the replacement level.
They argue that society is steeped in a mindset that views children as an intolerable hindrance, a hindrance to personal autonomy, financial wealth, and lifestyle convenience.
Let's break down the psychology of that connection. How exactly does a modern falling birth rate map onto an ancient man spilling his seed on a dirt floor?
Well, the authors define this as the spirit of Onan. It is a cultural desire to extract pleasure while aggressively rejecting duty, sacrifice, and covenantal fruitfulness.
Like separating the act from the consequence.
Yes. Onan wanted the physical union, the intimacy, and the pleasure, but he ran the math in his head and decided the resulting child would cost him too much of his financial inheritance. So the cultural critique here is that modern society runs the exact same math.
Yes. The sources argue we want the benefits of intimacy, but we view the natural fruit of that intimacy, children, as a threat to our inheritance.
And our inheritance today might be career advancement, disposable income, unrestricted travel.
But the selfish calculation remains identical.
The authors don't just point the finger at secular culture. What I found fascinating and honestly far more convicting is that they direct this critique squarely at the modern church.
They don't hold back.
They call out what they term spiritual Onans. What do they mean by that phrase?
They are referring to people sitting in the pews every Sunday who operate with the identical selfish calculation in their spiritual lives.
It's an internal church issue.
A huge one. A spiritual Onan is someone who wants the emotional ecstasy of modern worship, the comforting assurance of salvation, and the promise of heaven, but who absolutely refuses to carry the cross.
So they want the benefits of being married to Christ, but they refuse the cost of discipleship.
That's it. They refuse the agonizing duty of sanctification, submitting to church discipline, practicing self-denial, and bearing spiritual fruit.
The commentaries view this text as a direct, severe rebuke of the prosperity gospel and pragmatic, seeker-sensitive church models.
Yes, the authors argue these models promise the congregation constant blessing, emotional highs, and financial breakthrough without ever demanding obedience or repentance.
They are saying these models coddle the cultural sensibilities of the audience rather than confronting their self-centered autonomy.
Let's linger on that mapping for a second because it is incredibly sharp. Onan wanted the privileges of the marriage bed while refusing the obligations of the covenant.
The modern equivalent is wanting the privileges of the bridegroom Jesus while refusing to submit to his lordship. It is a demand for the benefits of the covenant while rejecting the obligations of the covenant.
And the warning derived from this is stark. God's patience must never be confused with his approval. The God who saw the hidden sin of and Onan in the ancient world is the same holy God who observes the hidden calculations of our hearts today. We cannot weaponize God's grace to fund our own selfishness.
The call to application here is a violent forsaking of self-centered autonomy. It is a call to cast ourselves entirely upon the faithful provision of Christ, recognizing that true life is found not in preserving our own inheritance, but in laying it down.
We have covered incredible ground today. We examined the hidden wickedness festering inside Judah's house, a rot that threatened the very lineage of the Messiah.
We looked at the terrifying severity of God's act of justice against the selfishness of and Onan, who tried to use God's design for their own gain while rejecting their duty.
We unpacked the cowardice of Judah, who abandoned the vulnerable Tamar out of fear, assuming he could manage God's promises through human pragmatism.
And through all that darkness, we saw the awe-inspiring reality of how the promised land is preserved. It isn't preserved by human virtue, moral superiority, or perfect families.
It is preserved by the sovereign grace of God, paving the way for the true kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, who gave his life to save a spiritually dead people.
The contrast is everything. Human failure is met with divine faithfulness. The text strips away our illusions of self-reliance and forces us to look to the only true source of redemption. As we wrap up this deep dive on Reformed thinking, I want to leave you with a new angle to consider.
Something to chew on.
We saw how God meticulously guarded the most vital lineage in human history through an incredibly unlikely, broken, and compromised cast of characters. The situation looked completely hopeless from a human perspective.
Totally ruined.
So where in your own life might you be writing off a situation as entirely too ruined for any good to come from it? If God can bring the Savior of the world through the wreckage of Judah's family, what might he be doing in the hidden spaces of your own story? Thank you for joining us.